boa noite a todos. É com imenso prazer que damos início a mais uma sessão do segundo simpósio A Água que nos conecta, Gestão, Política e Estratégica dos Recursos Hídricos, organizado pelo NAP Águas do Estado do Paraná, em parceria com a TWRA, a Aliança Tropical de Pesquisa d'Água. Hoje temos a honra de receber um distinto palestrante internacional, cujo renome e contribuições na área de ecologia de água doce atravessam fronteiras. Com um currículo repleto de realizações acadêmicas, experiências profissionais enriquecedoras e contribuições significativas por meio de publicações e pesquisas, ele vem para compartilhar conosco seus valiosos insights sobre as possibilidades de avaliação dos riscos das mudanças climáticas sobre a segurança hídrica para pessoas e natureza. Para mim, particularmente, essa palestra é muito especial, porque quando tudo ainda era mato e não tinha nem a TWRA ainda, lá em 2017, eu tive a feliz oportunidade de fazer o meu doutorado sanduíche sob a supervisão do Mark Kennard. Foram 5 meses na Austrália de muito aprendizado, de muitas alegrias, e eu pude publicar um artigo sobre as predições das mudanças climáticas sobre os peixes da bacia Murray-Darling. Agora, falando um pouquinho sobre o Mark, ele é um ecólogo quantitativo, tendo concluído seu doutorado em 2005 na Griffith University, onde fez toda a sua formação. Sua área de pesquisa é bem ampla, com expertise em hidroecologia, manejo de fluxo ambiental, biomonitoramento, avaliação da saúde dos ecossistemas, biodiversidade de água doce, planejamento de conservação e biogeografia e ecologia de peixes de água doce. Atualmente, ele ocupa cargos de destaque na Griffith University, no Australian River Institute, e lidera projetos de pesquisa importantes como a avaliação e recuperação de espécies ameaçadas em zonas úmidas costeiras queimadas. Dr. Kennard é reconhecido por sua colaboração com grupos de gestão de recursos naturais, comunidades indígenas e sociedades profissionais, além de ter recebido prêmios importantes como a Medalha Whitley e contribuir ativamente em comitês governamentais e organizações regionais. Sem mais delongas, permitam-me passar a palavra ao nosso estimado convidado. Good evening, Mark. I've just provided our audience with a brief overview of your career and the significant impact of your work, and, of course, about you as my supervisor in part of my PhD in Australia. It's truly a pleasure to have you here with us tonight. We are looking forward to your presentation and the opportunity to gain deeper insights from your expertise. So, the floor is yours. Please feel free to begin your presentation at your convenience.
Thanks very much, Aniele. My Portuguese is not so good, so I'm sure you said very nice things about me. Thank you very much for the invitation to give a presentation today. It's a great pleasure and honor for me. So I'm just going to share my screen. I hope you can all see that. Okay, so
yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to give a bit of a talk about some work we've been doing in Southeast Queensland in Australia to assess risks of climate change on water security for people who live in the region, but also the natural ecological values and biodiversity in the region, so the natural values of the region. This is a bit of a concern for us. You know, the climate is changing, populations are expanding, so it's always that challenge, and same around the world, how do we find that balance for provision of water for people, but also for nature? I'd just like to acknowledge some of my collaborators, so Song Yang Yu, David Hamilton, and Luke Carpenter-Bundu, as well as a whole range of other people. We've all worked together on a bunch of projects that I'm going to talk about today. So let's talk about water security. What do we mean by that? So the UN in 2013 came up with this very nice infographic about the multiple dimensions of water security. And they defined it as the ability to safeguard sustainable access to adequate quantities of acceptable quality water for sustaining livelihoods, human well-being, and socio-economic development. It's also about ensuring protection against waterborne pollution and water-related disasters, while at the same time attempting to preserve ecosystems in a climate of peace and political stability. So again, it's sort of multiple dimensions of water security. We're facing challenges all around the world about how we can achieve these quite lofty goals. So a key element of that is the concept of water scarcity. So there's water security, but there's water scarcity as well. So that's really about the fact that there's potentially insufficient water to simultaneously support both human and ecosystem water needs. So when we look around the world, it's been estimated that there's around 4 billion people are exposed to water scarcity for at least 1 month of the year. So anywhere on this map that's not green, that means there's potential water scarcity for at least a month of the year. And in fact, 500 million people are exposed to severe water scarcity all year round. So that's these dark red parts, including many parts of Australia, which are very arid. There's scarce water supplies to sustain people and biodiversity that does actually live in this region in inland Australia, but also parts of Central South America as well, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So, this is for recent past and current times, but when we think forward under a changing climate into the future, there's forecasts that climate change is going to exacerbate water security even further. So this highlights the massive global impacts of water scarcity on human livelihoods, as well as on natural systems now and into the future. So, these are obviously grand challenges for us collectively as scientists and managers. How do we deal with these really big global issues? And that's been recognised in the Sustainable Development Goals, many of which relate to provision of clean water for human livelihoods and sanitation, the risks around climate change and what we can do to adapt to climate change, how we can sustain life below water and life on land, all of which is dependent on clean water. So again, these, the UN has developed these Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that really provides a guide for a lot of the research we're doing at Griffith University at the Australian Rivers Institute to attempt to achieve some of these Sustainable Development Goals. So let's talk a little bit about Australia. So like many parts of the world, Australia is at increasing risk of severe water scarcity due to climate change. So this is a time series of mean annual temperature across the Australian continent over the last 100 years. And, there really is a clear trend to quite strong warming, particularly in the last 2 decades. That is resulting in extreme weather events. So we're seeing increasing extreme heat waves. This is a map showing that almost all of Australia has been exposed to these periodic extremely high temperatures, and that's really posing big challenges for people, but also the natural values and biodiversity in many parts of Australia. There's increasing severity of a whole range of other climate and climate-related events around drought, wildfire, and floods. So a couple of years ago, we had the worst drought on record. So this is a map of Australia, and the parts in dark red have experienced the lowest rainfall on record. For 150 years of the rainfall record, these periods have never experienced such extreme droughts. And in other parts, there's severe deficiencies of rainfall and water. And that's really led to changes in stream flow patterns. So this is a dry stream bed in a typically perennial river or stream in southeast Queensland. And you can see there's this one last residual water hole here where cattle are forced to find water, and that these little refuge water holes can be very important for sustaining biodiversity during dry periods. So you can see here an example of a competing use of water for cattle, for people, as well as potentially areas that sustain biodiversity. In following an extreme drought and heat wave in 2020, we had the worst wildfires on record. So massive parts of eastern and southern Australia and also northern Australia had very severe wildfires. And then there were floods after that caused post-fire runoff of very nasty toxic chemicals and sediment that caused big, severe water quality declines in many of our rivers and wetlands across Australia. So, these are just some of the examples of the increasing severity of threatening processes to sustainable available water for humans and people. So it's posing increasing risks to water security for people and as well as for nature. So in today's presentation, I'm going to give 3 case studies of our work in southeast Queensland and Australia. So just across the ocean from South America, here in southeast Queensland, So I'm going to firstly talk about some work we've been doing to forecast climate change impacts on catchment inflows to a large drinking water reservoir, and also evaluate the effects of low water levels on the quality of water in that reservoir. I'm going to give another case study on some work we did to evaluate the impacts of those severe wildfires I mentioned. We were looking at the impacts on coastal freshwater wetlands and the biodiversity within them of those fires. And the final case study I'm going to talk about is some work we've done to prioritise persistent surface water refuges, which are really critical to sustain biodiversity in dry periods. So we're looking to prioritise a subset of those areas for targeted conservation management to sustain biodiversity under a changing climate. So let's get stuck into it. So the first case study, we're looking at climate change impacts on catchment inflows to drinking water reservoirs and evaluating the effects of low water levels on reservoir water quality. So I'm based in Brisbane here in southeast Queensland. That's got a population of 2.5 million people, and it's growing rapidly. There's forecasts that we're going to grow to potentially 7 million people by the early 2030s. That's obviously putting a great strain on our water resources. One of our biggest water supply reservoirs is called Lake Wivenhoe. That's probably 30 kilometres west of Brisbane, positioned on the main stem of the large Brisbane River catchment. So that's where we collect water for people. It's pumped down to a water treatment plant and then provides water for consumptive uses in Brisbane. Lake Wivenhoe experiences quite major fluctuations in water supply over time. So this is a plot of water level in the reservoir over the last 30-year period. You know, it's periods where it's quite high, full supply, plenty of water for people, but there are periods when the water level goes down quite markedly. And it's in these periods that there's increasing concern for the availability and quality of water for human consumption in Brisbane and the surrounding areas. So in these periods of time, it actually triggers quite severe water restrictions. So the government imposes restrictions on water use and how we can use water. But there is concern when we look forward to the next 30, 50, 100 years, what's going to happen to the reliability of our water supply? So we need to be starting to come up with tools and approaches to help managers predict what is the reliability of water supply to supply our ever-expanding human population. So as I said, during these very dry periods of low water quality, this reservoir in particular is highly vulnerable to poor water quality and algal blooms. And so there's concerns about future water security under a changing climate with increasing water demand for a rapidly expanding human population. So we've done a whole lot of work modelling inflows, so river inflows into the reservoir under future projections of climate change. We've got a whole range of models with a bunch of collaborators. And this is just a plot of annual catchment inflows for each year under a historical period from the 1970s through to about 2020. And then we've used those models to forecast under future climate scenarios what might happen to those catchment inflows over time. And it's clear that, it's highly variable interannually. And it's also, you can see there's a general trend to a declining volume of water flowing into those water supply reservoirs. So that's a bit of concern. That does provide us with some concern about the availability of water into the future. And we need to be thinking, what can we be doing about that? Whether it's being better, more wise about how we use water. We need to avoid wasting water. And potentially we need to look much more at recycling of water and even potentially alternative sources of water. If we look at these projections of water availability and catchment inflows under climate change, what I've got here is the mean monthly flows for each month of the year for the baseline scenario, the reference period, as well as under a median projection under climate change. So this is the median forecast for the period around 2050, 2070, and 2090. So what you can clearly see is that the major period of catchment inflows is becoming concentrated in time to a narrower summer wet season, and the periods of dry catchment inflows are much longer over the rest of the year. And that becomes exacerbated further in time. So again, you can see it's a smaller wet season, potentially more intense, but the ability to store that water for the rest of the year is potentially affected because there's less rainfall and runoff for the rest of the year. So again, these types of tools about forecasting over time and looking at seasonality of changes in rainfall and runoff can really help managers plan for how they might deal with these kinds of issues into the future. Let's have a quick look at some of the biophysical responses to reduced catchment inflows and lower and more variable reservoir water levels in Lake Wivenhoe. So the reservoir itself, it's a very big reservoir, but it's quite a shallow, flat reservoir. So it's not particularly deep, but it's very wide and shallow. So that means in dry periods, there are extensive littoral areas that dry out as the water levels decrease. And during extreme droughts, actually all this vegetation dies off and becomes bare soil, which can blow, there's nutrients and sediments blow or run off into the remaining water and can cause quite severe water quality problems. And I'll talk about that now. So during those dry periods, there's often resuspension of sediment in shallow areas. There's runoff of nutrient-enriched surface water from the exposed sediments. This can also lead to increased release of metals like iron and manganese and nutrients, so phosphate and ammonium from the bottom sediments. And during the periods of low water level and increased temperatures can lead to reduced dissolved oxygen concentrations and also lead to hypoxic or anoxic water conditions throughout the water column. So we've developed some hydrodynamic models to model changes in temperature and DO and other parameters under various water and thermal scenarios, so catchment inflows and temperature scenarios. So this is the result of one of our models, just looking at changes in temperature dynamics through the vertical profile. So on the left axis is water level, and the y-axis is over time. So this is sort of daily temperature profiles over a 2-year period under different full water levels. So at at full supply, that's FSL, full supply water levels. So when there's high water levels, we can see that it's, a typical kind of vertical profile. There's high temperatures in the upper water column and lower temperatures in the lower water column. When it's very low water levels, so 10 or 20% full supply, you lose that thermal stratification. You're getting very elevated water temperatures right down to the bottom. And that can lead to increases in potentially harmful cyanobacteria blooms. And it's also led to fish kills in some circumstances because there's remobilization of sediment, increases in temperature that can facilitate, and also remobilization of nutrients, increased light penetration, and collectively these things can lead to harmful algal blooms and fish kills and other impacts. So obviously, these are big challenges. If you're interested in more information about this aspect of the work I'm presenting today, there's a recent report that we've produced. You can see the website there, and I'm happy to share this presentation after the talk today. But in summary, in this part of the work I'm talking about, we know that climate change is posing a serious challenge to the ability to provide adequate water quality and quantity for people. Water quality issues are posing increasing risks to drinking water quality and posing challenges to water resource management. And future water supplies are likely to be increasingly rely on climate resilient water sources. And so our work is really informing water utilities who manage these water resources for people on how best to prepare for an uncertain future. Okay, so I've talked about some of the challenges around water security and water scarcity and how that can potentially impact the quality and quantity of water for people. I'd now like to switch focus to talk more about some of the impacts on our natural values. And that's really what my background is around freshwater ecology and biodiversity. That's my real passion. Okay, so I'm going to give a case study about the impacts of those recent severe wildfires on some coastal freshwater wetlands. And here are just some images of these really severe fires. You can see these contributing catchments to these rivers and wetlands have been completely burnt. We're concerned about what the impacts of runoff of these fire and products of fire and what that might have to the biodiversity that lives in these wetlands. And this is just a picture of one of these little wetlands that was completely burnt for much of its surrounding area and it actually destroyed a lot of the surrounding vegetation. So let's get into it. So you might know that, fire is an integral component of the history of the Australian landscape. It's shaped ecosystems around the world, and particularly in Australia, for millions of years. And so the plants and animals are somewhat adapted to those historical fire regimes. But there is concern about the increasing frequency and severity of fires in Australia in particular under a changing climate, and some of the risks that might pose for people and nature. So in 2019 and 2020, there was what's known as the Black Summer megafires in southeastern Australia. This was the result of a 3-year drought that culminated in record-setting dry and hot temperatures and created extreme fire weather conditions. These extreme fires killed 33 people, sadly. It destroyed more than 3,000 houses. It burned 10 million hectares of habitat for native plants and animals, and led to the direct mortality of a whole range of animals as well that we care about, like koalas and kangaroos. And so this prompted a rapid risk assessment. I was involved in this work funded by the Federal Government Department of Environment, in which we assessed the responses of 92 high priority vertebrates and 213 invertebrate species. We prioritised those for urgent management responses, including the evaluation of impacts on coastal wetland fish and frog species, which is my particular area of expertise. So when we're talking about these coastal wetlands, in Eastern Australia, they're known as Wallam ecosystems. So some of you may have heard of that word. It's Aboriginal word for a species of Banksia, which is a type of shrub that occurs in Eastern Australian coastal areas. So this area is flora-rich shrubland and heathland on really very sandy soils in that coastal Eastern Australian strip. It kind of looks like this kind of beautiful kind of environment. The wetlands in these Wallam areas are very nutrient poor. They're highly acidic, pH down to 3, and they're very tannin stained. So you can see it in this image here. So you probably have these types of wetlands in Brazil, I'm not sure, but they're certainly a real feature of this Eastern Australian coastal area. And they're really interesting and important because they support a highly specialised set of species that are endemic to this type of ecosystem. So that includes a set of fish, frogs, and invertebrates, so some crustaceans and insects, aquatic insects, as well as a range of aquatic and emergent plant species as well. So they're a really interesting place, and they're very close to Brisbane, so I like working there. Unfortunately, this type of ecosystem has seen a massive decline in the quality of the health of these ecosystems and also the extent of them due to catchment land use change. So they've been clearing and draining a lot of these wetlands for urban development. But there are some pockets of it still remaining in World Heritage areas, national parks, and Ramsar sites in this region. So these types of ecosystems, they do burn. It's a natural process that maintains the structure and function of these Wallam ecosystem landscapes. And so the species that live in them have evolved to coexist with fire. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about how they might respond to extreme wildfires, these types of ecosystems, and particularly increasing the severity and frequency of those types of fire events. We don't know how they're able to respond and how resilient they are to these changing fire dynamics. So again, these are some images of the recent fires just near Brisbane where I live. And, it's really a devastating effect you can see here. So again, we knew nothing about what some of these nationally listed threatened species, how are they able to persist in these wetlands in the face of such severe fires. We can hypothesize, however, that these intense fires could cause direct mortality of aquatic species. So when a fire burns through the riparian zone or across the landscape, semi-aquatic species like frogs and turtles and some crustacea, they could potentially just get burnt by them. We might expect that there's a degradation of the riparian and aquatic habitat due to the burning of vegetation and the post-burn runoff of toxicants, nutrients, and sediments into these water bodies once the fire has passed through. So this is a bit of a conceptual model of how these fires might impact these types of ecosystems. We also hypothesize that aquatic species like fish and truly aquatic species, fish, invertebrates, we hypothesise they probably have low resistance to fire and may be slow to recover after very intense fires. And that might cause risks for local extinctions because these are highly fragmented populations. So they rarely connect to other source populations. So if they're extirpated from this water body, the question is how long, will they recover from that? It depends on their proximity to other source populations in that metapopulation context. So the severity and mechanisms of fire-related impacts in these systems, we think they're likely to vary a lot depending on the characteristics of the wetland. So things like size, the morphometry of the wetland, how deep it is, characteristics of the contributing catchment area, what's the vegetation and soil type, and how large the contributing catchment is that might lead to changes in the runoff of these toxicants and sediments. The resilience to these fire impacts might also depend on other stressors that are occurring in the catchment and within the water body itself. So a lot of these wetlands are becoming invaded by non-native fish, they're invaded by weeds, and there's other human impacts associated with clearing and draining and so on. So their resilience to fire might also depend on these other kind of stressors that are also imposed on them. So a big challenge for understanding what the impacts of these fires might have been and what we might do about it. So the aims of our study were we undertook a big survey of a whole range of Wallen wetlands. We did quantitative surveys of fish and frog in these wetlands following that Black Summer bushfires. And that was really aimed at assessing the impacts of fire and other threats on these Wallen wetland species. And that was intended to establish a baseline understanding of the distribution of these species, their present-day population status, and key threats to them to inform ongoing monitoring and management. I should say it's been more than 30 years since the last quantitative survey of these ecosystems. So we have pretty poor knowledge on what is the current status of these wetlands and how they responded to fire. So let's have I'll introduce you to the species that live in these wetlands. They're things that I think are very beautiful. So there's a set of fish that are nationally listed threatened species. So there's the Oxleyan pygmy perch that's endangered, the honey blue-eye, this beautiful little yellow fish with green and blue eyes, as well as the ornate rainbow fish that has beautiful rainbow colours on its side. These are small fish endemic only to these little wetlands. There's also an assemblage of frog species, which also are conservation dependent and listed as threatened species, whole range of different frogs, amazing critters. And unfortunately, there's a set of non-native species that have invaded these wetlands. So the gambusia you might have heard of, the platy, it's probably invading Brazil as well. The cane toad, which I believe is from South America. So unfortunately, these have invaded these eastern Australian wetlands and are potentially causing problems for the native fish and frogs in terms of competition and predation and so on. So this is an example of another stressor in addition to the potential impacts of fire. So our study area in southeastern Queensland, northern New South Wales, the little yellow white dots are all the fish sampling sites that we surveyed. You'll see that some were in areas not affected by the fires. Some sites were within the fire footprint, which is this purple to yellow areas. And then similar for frogs, we sampled a whole range of sites indicating green dots that were inside and outside the fire zone. So that gave us a way to compare, the impacts of fire versus those where they weren't affected by fire. So wetland fire exposure ranged from none to very high. We use a range of standardized sampling methods, so we compare between locations. So we were using fish trapping, electrofishing, and we collected the fish, identified them, measured them, and then released them alive and unharmed in the water body. We also did some visual and oral census of frogs, and we did a whole range of habitat, water quality, and assessing other threats as well. And it was all great fun. So let's have a look at the sites we sampled. So as I said, we sampled across a gradient of fire exposure. So we did a sort of a quantitative fire severity score that ranged from very low through to very high. So this was a fire severity score for the catchment contributing to the water body, whether it was a stream or a wetland. We used GIS to estimate the contributing catchment fire severity score. We also then evaluated the fire impacts to the riparian zone around each water body. And again, this ranged from very low to moderately high. And then we also did an assessment of the impacts in the aquatic zone, so the water body itself, in terms of ash deposition, sediment deposition, also wood fire and woody debris in the water body. And you can sort of see that, you know, although the contributing catchment had very high impacts in some situations, it became progressively less once you got to the riparian zone and the aquatic zone. So that was quite interesting. So there was limited impacts apparent in the aquatic zones. So just a quick introduction to the species that we collected. We collected 32 species of fish across these 150 wetlands. The listed threatened species, you know, were moderately abundant and widespread in some circumstances. Unfortunately, so those introduced fish I mentioned were also quite widespread and abundant. Same with the frogs. The listed threatened species were quite abundant, which is still, you know, which is encouraging. They're still present and abundant. But the cane toads, the introduced cane toad, is also expanding in abundance. Just to drill into that data in a bit more detail. So this is for our priority, our focal species, the listed threatened species, as well as the non-native species. What we did was compare the distribution or the frequency of sites with our earlier surveys that were done 30 years ago compared to our recent sampling. And this shows that, you know, the honey blue eye was present at 7 sites in which it used to occur. So there was a sustained population at 7 sites, pygmy perch at 22 sites, ornate rainbow fish at 40 sites. Similar kinds of patterns with frogs. You know, they were persisting at sites in which that occurred prior to the fire 30 years ago. Our data revealed new records, so it reflects how little sampling has been done in these areas. So we got a whole range of new records of these threatened species. But unfortunately, there are a whole range of places where there were prior records, which we sampled after the fire, which we didn't collect them again. And so those places where we didn't collect them on that first occasion, we went back to those places on up to 3 separate sampling occasions to confirm their local extinction. So the question there is, there's a bunch of sites where these species used to occur. They no longer occur after the fires. The question is that due to the fire or is it due to other interacting stressors? We're not sure. I'd like to also just mention about the introduced fish and cane toads. They're becoming increasingly widespread. So before, you know, in the historical surveys, the gambusia and platy weren't really particularly prevalent, but now they're much more prevalent across these sites. And that's a similar pattern for the cane toads as well. They're definitely spreading. Okay, so let's just quickly have another look at the data in terms of the potential fish responses to the fire impacts. So here I've color-coded sites as whether they were fire affected, so that's the red color, and if they weren't affected by the fire, these are sites that were colored in green. And for each species, I've plotted up the abundance of those species in not fire affected and fire affected sites, and that was for each one of our priority species. So the Oxleyan pygmy perch, this species here, and the ornate rainbow fish, this species here, they were on average less abundant in the fire affected sites than in the fire affected sites. But there's relatively little difference in the frequency of occurrence, so there's patterns of occupancy. So they were equally prevalent in fire affected sites and in unaffected sites. The introduced species were more common, more prevalent in the fire-affected sites, and they were more, and the gambusia in particular was much more abundant in the fire-affected sites. So this is starting to tell us something. You know, some species might be resilient to fire. It's somewhat equivocal, the extent to which that's changed the abundance and the occupancy patterns. It's not compelling results. Similar for frogs. So one species, the Wallam froglet, that was actually much more abundant in fire-affected sites, whereas cane toads were less abundant, and whereas it was little difference for some of the other species. And there was little difference in the occupancy patterns related to fire. So this might be counterintuitive. You might have expected if frogs were highly sensitive to fire, you would expect them to be much less common and less prevalent in fire-affected sites. But that didn't seem to be the case from our data. which is actually quite encouraging. So to summarise these results, I think overall there's limited evidence of the impacts of those recent severe fires on the distribution and abundance of fish and frogs. But in some sites, there were some localised extinctions. And that might be due to fire. It might have been due to that they potentially have dried out. The water body itself may have dried out prior to the fires during that extreme drought period. We don't have good data on the water levels in a lot of these water bodies. They're very difficult to map and model because a lot of them are very small. So it's highly possible that it was rather the drought that caused these localized extinctions rather than the subsequent fires. And we really don't understand well what the potential impacts of these rapidly expanding introduced fish and frogs, cane toad species might be having. We do think that the resistance and resilience to fire impacts is likely highly context dependent. So really depending on the individual wetland characteristics, are they very large water bodies that might buffer the impacts of post-fire runoff of sediment and nutrients versus very small lakes that might be highly vulnerable to post-fire runoff. Resilience might also be dependent on connectivity to source populations, as I mentioned, and there's a whole range of other factors that might influence that. We do think that the threats to these wetland ecosystems and the unique species they support, those threats are likely intensifying with ongoing climate change. So that's, intensifying fires, the frequency and severity of drying events, increasing temperatures or increasing thermal regimes is a risk. A lot of these areas are these are coastal freshwater wetlands. Sea levels are rising. The frequency of saltwater intrusions is increasing. So that's another challenge. These freshwater species are not tolerant of high salinity. So, and there's also that ongoing risk of increasing spread of invasive species. So the cumulative impacts of these multiple stresses is a bit of a concern. So, this research is sort of a first step in informing ongoing management and monitoring of these wild and wetland species and their habitats, and hopefully will inform more proactive conservation strategies for how we can deal with those increasing threats into the future. Okay, I'm going to now talk about my third case study, and that's thinking about, as I mentioned, what can we do about these things? How can we prioritize areas for really targeted conservation management in the face of these types of threatening processes? So I'm going to now focus on riverine systems. There's a massive riverine network in southeast Queensland. A lot of those streams in the river network are intermittent, so they're naturally intermittent, but the concern is that the extent of intermittency is increasing as we're extracting more and more water or intercepting water, and under a future climate where changes in rainfall and runoff are potentially increasing the frequency and extent of intermittency. So that flow intermittency in turn affects the availability of surface water as well as groundwater, but certainly surface water, which are really critical refuge habitats for freshwater biodiversity in dry periods. So that's what I'm going to talk about today in this case study. So as I mentioned, intermittent streams in southeastern Queensland, they're quite prevalent. And so when I talk about intermittent streams, these are areas of the river network where surface water flow ceases for some period of most years. They're very widespread in southeastern Queensland, and they're very hydrologically dynamic. So they periodically experience cease to flow spells of varying frequency and duration. So this is just a time series of daily flow. You can see there are these periods of wet periods and cease to flow periods, and it can vary in the duration and timing of when those dry and wet periods occur. These are natural processes in many parts of Eastern Australia, but the frequency and severity of these dry and wet periods is certainly changing. During these dry periods, when the water ceases to flow, surface water becomes restricted to a series of disconnected pools, or the stream bed can dry out completely. So here's how that looks. So this is a stream near Brisbane. Obviously during wet periods, there's lots of water, it's all connected. Fish and other organisms can move up and down the stream. As water levels recede, they become restricted to these dry season water holes. And if the dry season persists for long enough, the stream bed can dry out completely or be left to this little restricted water body that can be highly vulnerable to other impacts, like impacts of cows. I showed that photo earlier, declines in water quality, and desiccation ultimately. So these water bodies, really important for sustaining biodiversity. And that's what I'm going to talk about, how we might prioritise which of these water bodies could we focus our conservation management interventions on so they don't get to this point. Let's talk about these residual water bodies, though. They really are critical refuges for aquatic biodiversity. They're critical for the persistence of aquatic animals and plants during extended dry spells. So these are just some of the amazing flora and fauna that we have in southeast Queensland. Beautiful, amazing crayfish, turtles, beautiful rainbow fish, platypus you might have seen. You know, these water bodies are critical for the persistence of water for platypus during dry periods, as well as a whole range of interesting water birds. We can conceptualize, you know, what are those aspects of the river waterhole sort of system that might make them important as refuges. So there's sort of different biophysical processes that lead to their value as refuges for biodiversity. So it can depend on their relative position in the river network. So if they're positioned way up in the headwaters, it may not provide a refuge for biodiversity that could then recolonize large areas of the stream once flows resume. So potentially those areas that are in the mid to lower catchments, we might choose to prioritise those because they could potentially make greater reaches or sections of stream recolonizable. The duration of persistence of the water body during dry periods, that's another sign that they might be a high quality refugia for biodiversity. And also some aspects of their physicochemical parameters. So the morphometry, the depth, the size, and their water quality characteristics. These types of factors could be considered as you think about their value as a potential refuge for biodiversity during dry periods and under a changing climate into the future. There are other factors that we need to consider as we think about areas we might prioritise for conservation management. And that really is around the intensity of other anthropogenic disturbances on these water holes. So there is a lot of surface and groundwater extraction for a whole range of uses in a lot of these streams around southeast Queensland. There's increasing water pollution and riparian degradation, so clearing of riparian zones. Livestock, when they're able to access the river network and these refuge water holes, they can have severe impacts on the quality of those water bodies. Same with invasive animals like feral pigs. Weed invasion, so this is Salvinia. I think it's another South American aquatic plant that's invaded Australia. And also, nutrient inputs and algal blooms. These are all things that humans have exacerbated, these types of impacts that have potentially impacted the value of these refuge these water holes as refuges for biodiversity. They may also be highly vulnerable to future climate changes in terms of the persistence of that surface water bodies and their frequency and duration of connections to other parts of the river network. So these are types of things we need to consider as we think about which subset of areas might we prioritise for management so we can ensure that we can sustain the biodiversity not only on a seasonal and interannual basis, but also over that much longer term, over the next 50, 100 years in the face of a changing climate. Because what we don't want to see is increasing severity of things like fish kills. So you do see this periodically in southeast Queensland, particularly places in the Murray-Darling. You might have heard of really severe and widespread fish kills. That's in part due to water quality problems in those refuge water holes during those very dry periods. So how can we prioritise a set of areas for efficient and effective conservation management? You know, we have limited budgets for conservation management. We can't actively manage everywhere. So the challenge here is how can we identify a subset of areas that might give us the most benefit if we were to prioritise some on-ground actions in those areas. So here the aim is to select a minimum set of aquatic refuge areas to represent as much of the aquatic biodiversity as possible, whilst minimising the costs. So when I say cost, it might be the costs of during riparian restoration, the cost of restricting access to water, It's very difficult to quantify these costs, but we can use surrogates for cost in terms of avoiding disturbed areas that are obviously going to be more expensive to restore, rather than preferentially selecting areas that are minimally disturbed that might be cheaper to maintain their current good condition. So the approach we've taken to prioritise those refuge areas for conservation, we base that on an approach based on a principle of complementarity. So this is defined as a measure of the extent to which an area or set of areas contributes unrepresented biodiversity to an existing area or set of areas. So if we had an area, what's the minimum set of areas we would need to add to that selected area for the least cost and with the maximal representation of biodiversity? It's well founded in the literature, this idea of complementarity, and there are a whole range of sort of software packages you can use that have been developed and applied largely in terrestrial and marine realms for conservation prioritization and conservation planning, but they're increasingly being applied in freshwater systems. So you might have heard of Marxan and zonation. These are the types of approaches that are widely used, and we use a similar approach. We wrote our own code in R to do this, but it's based on a similar approach that is well used in the literature. So in our prioritization, we were interested in the spatial distribution of biodiversity across our river networks, the spatial distribution of threats posed by human activities. Importantly, we also had models of changes in hydrologic connectivity and surface water persistence under climate change projections. So they're critical layers of information to help us prioritize refuge areas that would be efficient and effective to manage under the present day, but also into the future. So I'm just going to show some of the the models that we've used, that we've developed and used in this prioritization work. So it works. So this is just we've done models of the daily stream flow in which we can then map changes in flow intermittency. So you can see in Southeast Queensland, a lot of these stream segments are highly intermittent. So the darker red they are, the more intermittent they are over the years. Let's run that again. And that varies a lot from year to year. So, this poses a problem, where in this river network might there be persistent water bodies given how interannually variable flows are over time? And so we've developed and calibrated these daily flow models and then downscaled some climate change projections and use those models to predict stream flow for 100 years into the future. So that was a critical input data layer for our prioritization. We have also modeled and developed a predictive model of surface water extent using this and other information. So this is annual variation in the percent of the stream segment that is retaining surface water during dry periods. So again, you can see it's quite dynamic. Where are those areas with highly persistent water in the stream network? We've also developed predictive models of species distributions throughout the river network for freshwater fish. So we had models for 25 freshwater fish species. And we also had spatially explicit layers quantifying the intensity of different river disturbances caused by catchment land use and flow regime alteration. So we used all these sets of information. We brought that together to develop a prioritization of aquatic refuges for biodiversity. And as I mentioned, we had modeled stream flow, which we could then model changes in stream length over time in which there was surface water retained in that river network. So for the reference period, 2090 to 2020, 2019 to 2020, I think it was, I don't remember. This is the average annual stream length with persistent surface water. So, sort of on average, about bit over 10,000 kilometres of stream with persistent surface water. If we look at forecasts under different climate projections, so under a dry projection in our different future time periods, we can see that the amount of streams throughout the river network with persistent water in the river network is actually declining quite markedly. So it's going from more than 10,000 down to less than 9,000 kilometres of stream. Under a wet scenario, it's actually increasing quite a lot. And this difference between the wet and dry scenarios really represents our high degree of uncertainty and what the future is going to look like. It might actually be a lot wetter, but the concern is it actually might be a lot drier. So we need to be planning for what the future might bring in terms of the persistence of stream flow and surface water, and what that might do for the persistence of freshwater biodiversity. So this is just a map of annual surface water extent, the average annual surface water extent under a wet scenario. You can see much of the region has got highly persistent surface water, so that's encouraging, but under a dry scenario, you can see much of the river network is actually dry for most of the year. And so that can become quite a concern again for the persistence of biodiversity. So how can we bring this information together to come up with a set of priority areas that we might focus our management on? So here's the results of that prioritisation analysis. So in the reference period, it was 1999 to 2018. This is a subset of the river network where the areas in dark blue are selected more commonly in our range of solutions. So they're highly irreplaceable is another term for this. So these are areas that we could prioritise for conservation management. They've met our input parameters around avoiding disturbed areas, while at the same time trying to represent as much of the biodiversity as possible. In this case, we'd set a target of aiming to represent 25% of the present day distribution of each one of our freshwater fish species. So this is selecting about 10% of the entire river network to meet those conservation objectives. So again, it's coming back to that conservation challenge. We can't manage all our river segments, but we can use these types of information to identify a subset of priority areas where we most efficiently deploy our limited conservation resources, hopefully with the best benefit. If we compare that prioritising for present day versus prioritising for future hydrology and future surface water under a future climate, you get quite a different set of priority areas identified. So under the wet period, there's actually overall, there's less segments were selected for priority, and they're much more widely dispersed throughout the river networks, whereas in the dry period, we have fewer options for where that biodiversity might be persisting given the availability of surface water and hydrologic connectivity. So it's really concentrating our priority areas into a much smaller part of the river network, and was actually unable to meet our representation targets for biodiversity as well. So, these are just lines of information that managers can use to help identify where they might focus their conservation prioritisation work. So these are potential focus areas for targeted conservation management. They don't give you the solution, but they're giving you lines of information that you can use to work with local landholders and other stakeholders to think about what you might do in those areas into the future. And that's a big challenge. How could we best manage these refuge water holes to maintain the persistence of biodiversity? So what are those options we might have? So there are some candidate actions we know we could be deploying now and into the future to maintain these refuge water holes and the biodiversity that lives in them. So we could work with farmers and landholders to manage and mitigate runoff of nutrients and sediments and pesticides into the river networks. There's active riparian zone management, so restricting livestock access to rivers and wetlands, replanting the riparian zone, like this image here. Ultimately, we might need to impose restrictions on surface water and groundwater extraction near these high priority refuge areas to help ensure their persistence during very dry periods. Management of invasive plants and animals, so whether it's active removal of riparian weeds or thinking about creative ways to control invasive animal spread. And critically, I think improving the awareness of the ecological values of intermittent streams and persistent aquatic refuges. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people don't appreciate the critical importance of these types of streams and water holes and why they're really important to sustain biodiversity during dry periods. So that's another lever we can pull in terms of working with society to improve their awareness of those ecological values and how they can also benefit people. So there's some critical challenges around all this. One key one is how best to engage and not alienate stakeholders in the planning process. So, there's competing uses of water. If we're talking about restricting access to water for grazing and agriculture, they might see that as a risk to their livelihood. So really it's involving those different types of stakeholders and landholders in this planning process. So it's really referred to as participatory planning, where we can work together to identify what are the realistic management options we can implement, whilst at the same time minimizing impacts on our stakeholders. It's a big challenge, but the only way to do it is to work together in a participatory way. Prioritizing and doing on-ground management really does require adequate resourcing, so dollars for on-the-ground conservation management. So it obviously raises the question, who's going to pay for these types of management actions into the future? It also requires a long-term commitment to monitor the efficacy of whatever conservation actions you might deploy in particular places at particular times, so we can better understand what's effective, what doesn't work, and change our management actions into the future to adapt to those learnings we have. So that's really about adaptive management and planning for an uncertain future. So I think that's all I've got on this topic. So we've published a bit of work on this. Point you to these papers and a report that we did recently. Again, we're just scratching the surface on some of these issues, but I think we're making incremental steps about how we can understand the distribution and ecological requirements of these elements of biodiversity and how they might respond to a changing climate and water availability, and potentially what are the types of things we can be doing about it. So I'm going to stop there. I guess my final slide is coming back to where I started. What do we mean by water security and water scarcity? It does come back to these lofty goals about thinking creatively about how we can ensure there's good quality drinking water to sustain well-being, quality and availability of water to sustain ecosystems. How can we plan for water-related hazards and climate change in an uncertain future? And how can we bring resources and financing and collaboration to tackle these challenges? We're living in an uncertain time. The population around the world is growing. These are going to be increasingly big challenges that we all have a responsibility to address together. So I look forward to working with you all as we tackle these grand challenges for society. I'd really like to thank the following people for their kind invitation to give a presentation today, particularly Aniele Oliveira. Great to see you again, Aniele. Thanks to Professor Yara Moretto and also to Valeria Ilotti Lared for helping organise today and keeping me on track. Thanks to my audience for listening. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I'm happy to take some questions. And I hope to all see you in Foz do Iguaçu in a month or so. Thank you very much. Oh, and just one final thing, I'd like to acknowledge all the people and organisations that have funded our work. So you can see their logos. And this is a final slide of what we call a dingo. It's a native dog that's native to Australia, and this is it standing next to a large wetland on Algari on Fraser Island near Brisbane, one of the beautiful native animals that live in Australia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for the lecture. It was really great to hear those 3 case studies, and I think Brazil and Australia, we share the same challenge in front of climate change. So thank you very much for this insight. We have some questions. If you can help us with the answers. The first one is from Professor Sandro. And we note that the fish and frog species in the second case study decreased in those environments. And was there any invasive species that adapted, or a new species that emerged?
Yes, again, I think it was highly context dependent, the impacts of fire. So we do think in some wetlands, particularly the small wetlands in which the contributing catchment burnt entirely, we saw local extinctions, and we do think they were due to the fire. But that was not a common circumstance. The majority of sites that were exposed to fire, the threatened species did persist after the fire. So that was encouraging. So again, it's a complex story. Some places are highly vulnerable to fire, other places are not. And that's partly because these species have evolved in the presence of fire for a long time. What we don't have a good understanding, though, of is the interaction of fire with drought, because there was a big drought period that did dry out some of these wetlands and may have caused an localized extinction before the fire, as well as the increasing invasion by non-native fish and toads. And we are worried that they're spreading, they're getting moved around by people. When the water bodies connect, they're moving that way as well. So Gambusia and some of the other small fish species, once they've invaded these wetlands, it's impossible to remove them. So it is an ongoing concern, and we're worried about the cumulative effect of these interacting stresses, what we can do to mitigate those types of impacts. So yes, big challenge, but these are beautiful endemic fish that I think are really important components of biodiversity, and we should be caring about them. I hope that answers your question.
Where is Gambusia from, Mark?
I think it's Central America. So Panama, around there, I think. Someone could correct me in the audience, but Central America, I think. Yeah, but it's global invasive species, listed noxious species in Australia. Yep.
Yes. And do you know how it was introduced in Australia?
I do. In Queensland, it was first arrived in Queensland, as far as I know. And our state government forestry department, they had a policy in the 1950s that every forester who was going out to do forestry work would take a bucket of Gambusia with them and release it into the waterway, because in those days, their common name was the mosquito fish. They were regarded as being a predator of mosquito larvae, that aquatic insect larvae. So the policy was to put Gambusia everywhere, these mosquito fish everywhere. But it turns out that native Australian fish are just as effective predators of mosquito larvae as these introduced fish. And I guess there wasn't the awareness at the time that that type of biological control method actually caused problems for native species. So competition with native fish and eating the eggs of native fish and so on. So unfortunately, that was a policy then. We've wised up a bit lately. So now we know that we shouldn't be moving these introduced fish around. Unfortunately, it still does happen accidentally or intentionally. So that's an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, we are with the same problem here in Brazil right now, because we are in a crisis of dengue, and the media is spreading the information that there are poisoned fish eat the mosquito, but it's not true. So it's being spread out over the country.
That's why I don't like to call them mosquito fish. I just call them Gambusia, or there's other names for it. But yeah, it is a big challenge how you can inform the community about the risks of these types of threats, and to encourage different ways of thinking about prevention and management. Big challenge.
Let me see if we have more questions. I have one more. You mentioned that the issues with reservoir for human supply, and here we have the problem with hydroelectric reservoir. And so we have a kind of energy insecurity. So how is this in Australia? Do you have an energy insecurity also?
Yes, I mean, that's a really great point, Anelia. And something I didn't mention was that combination of energy insecurity, water insecurity, and food insecurity. They're all related, particularly when you think about river systems and water. That connects them, doesn't it? So in Australia, there is increasing demand for energy and renewable sources of energy. I mean, Australia for a long time has exported coal, and we're heavily reliant on fossil fuels. That is changing in the last years. We're much more aware of the necessity to change our energy sources. So there's massive increases in solar panels, solar energy, but also hydropower is another big one. So it's becoming, just in the last couple of years, there's more proposals for pumped hydro storage developments. So where they build a big, they have an existing or new reservoir and they build another reservoir upstream and they pump the water between them and create energy that way. There is no doubt that that's also will have pose potential risks for carbon emissions, methane emissions from the new water storages, changes to flow regimes downstream of the water of the reservoirs. That's another risk. Another big risk, which people are becoming more aware of, is land clearing for the new power lines that need to be built to to move that energy from the hydropower storage site to where it's used. So we're looking at clearing great areas of land, like native forest, for the power lines, the wires. So that's another hidden cost of this energy, alternative energy supply. So the extent to which it's renewable, in some contexts it's renewable, but there's the potential that it's having irreversible effects on biodiversity and ecosystem processes in freshwater ecosystems. So it's, again, how can we quantify the impacts and think about how we can mitigate some of those risks from these two new types of energy sources? Yeah, but great point, Aniela. Everyone's gone to bed.
So I think, sorry?
Has everyone gone to bed? It's late at night in Brazil.
Yes. So I'd like to thank you once again, Mark, for being with us tonight. I wish you a good day in Australia, and that's it.
Thank
See
you very
you
much,
in
Annie.
May.
Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all in May. Yes, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Agradeço, então, a participação de todos nesse último dia do nosso simpósio. Espero que vocês tenham aproveitado. Deixem seus comentários nas redes sociais também. E desejo uma boa noite a todos. Até mais. Tchau, tchau.
Obrigado.